Okay, everybody, we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Matthew Mund. I'm the current Northwest AGUHO Corporate Relations Director. And so I'm here to introduce our October 1st Friday with Northwest AGUHO speaker, Nick. Sorry, I just navigated away. Nick received his master's in student affairs and higher education from Indiana State University and has been working at the University of Oregon as a community director for the last 7 years. Nick also volunteered time working with the Working Families Party of Oregon on issues that support candidates that stand for needs of working families. Nick joins us today to present on his session titled Untapped Data Mines. As just kind of general housekeeping, you can feel free and keep your videos off or on. The session will be recorded and posted for future use by our Northwest AGUHO member institutions. So just be aware of that. Thank you, everybody. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you. And so welcome. I appreciate you all coming in. This is the first time I'll be presenting this type of data and this information. So any feedback throughout as well, you can ask to slow down all of that, move forward. But basically, I just wanted to talk about how there's so much that we can learn from a lot of data that we already have without a lot of extra work. You just have to look at the data with a different perspective. And so this is all exploring data that you can get, particularly from student leader recruitment and selection interviews. So I'm just gonna jump right in. And so I know sometimes data can be really scary for a lot of people, particularly when you look at something like this. There's a lot of numbers. And so I'm gonna try and break this down for you, but this can be like a really simple way to look at the scoring, interview scoring that you get after interviewing. And most of the time, we actually don't really look at the individual question answers, the subtotals, all of that. A lot of times what people are interested in is the specific scores for the specific candidates. And what you can tell here is that candidate 1 and candidate 2, they seem to score the highest throughout the interview process. And so if you're looking at it just with the lens that this interview data specifically only shows what candidates are best for the position, but you can also start to flip that around by looking at it from a different perspective. Instead of organizing the data by the individual candidates, I've now organized it by the interviewers' answers here. And some things that you can start to see jump out in this data here is that there's a few things that you can notice. So Nick here had an average score of 14. Sam had an average score of 13. And when you look at the total average of everybody's scores, it's about 9.75. So when you're looking at this data, you not only see that the potential for understanding what candidates are good for a position, but also are the reviewers potentially biasing the data in some way? And so over the course of the interviews, Nick here would have scored each candidate much higher than other participants. Now, when you only have 5 or 6 candidates, this data doesn't really tell you all that much because it's very likely that Nick could have had 3 really exceptional candidates and Tyler could have had lower qualified candidates for the positions. But particularly with student staff selection, you get an opportunity to start seeing that on a larger scale. I know here at University of Oregon, we interview sometimes up to 300 or 400 people. And so when you start getting into data points where one interviewer is interviewing at least 30, 40 people, then you can actually start to see trends. It's pretty unlikely that one interviewer is only going to see really highly qualified candidates versus low qualified candidates. So this is something that I just like to point out in particular, because you can just by simply sorting and looking at the data in a different way, you can start to learn a lot about the process. And this can also provide valuable learning opportunities for for your staff and for those who are interviewing. So some proactive steps that you can take to talk about this in a way is establishing digestible criteria for evaluation for all interviewers. Basically, if you haven't gone through the process to actually show people like this is how you can be biased in situations, then they might score differently. And if you don't have that specific established criteria, everybody's going to be using their own criteria for selecting the answers and their scoring for interviews. And so this would be something to definitely think about beforehand. You can do role play activities. You can have, before interviews start in a group setting, you can ask the interview questions and have a sample answer. And one of the things that you can do is actually have people then score based on that one same interview answer. So you can take all of your interviewers in the same room and see, even before you get to the interview process, whether or not somebody tends to score higher or lower, and kind of talk about what questions and answers mean. So that would be a more in-depth activity that you can do. You can also have fewer scoring options. So on the scale that I had in that data, it was on a 1 through 5 scale. What is the difference between a 4 and a 5? Is there anything that can really like bump you up? Do you have good enough criteria for evaluation that there's a very distinct difference in what a 4 and a 5 means? Or was that off of somebody's personal feelings on, yeah, it wasn't the best answer, or not? And so if you start lowering the scale, then you start getting into meets qualifications, exceeds qualifications, and doesn't meet qualifications. And it's a lot easier to place people into similar ranges without some of that bias coming in, because then somebody isn't artificially inflated much higher than other people. One of the suggestions that the OSU search advocate training provides is actually eliminating numeric scoring altogether. And that's something that I think we'll get into a little bit more later, but there's a lot of ways that you can score and evaluate interviews even without that numerical scoring. And then establishing scoring ranges at the end of the interview process. Let's say you can have a total amount of points. Let's say it's 50 total points. You can group everybody that is in who got from 40 to 50. And even though individual people might have higher scores at that point in time, they're all basically in the same group. And so some of those individual differences between those 4s and 5s, et cetera, that can start going away because you're grouping people together. And so that's another one of those steps that you can take to eliminate a little bit of that bias. And then training interviewers on the bias that can occur prior to interviews. There's a lot of good resources out there that talk about all sorts of different ways that bias can come up. It can be recency, it can be whether somebody is similar to you, shares similar identities, all sorts of things that can get into that. If anybody would like, you can feel free to email me. I do have some resources I can share out as well that talk about the potential biases that come into interview processes. Another reflective activity that you can do after is, I've actually led this with my pro staff here at University of Oregon in the past. I averaged out everybody's scores. Also, just as a side note, these scores aren't real. That's just data that I've entered in. So I averaged the scores out for each individual person. I didn't publish them to everybody, and I just handed them out to each individual person. And I reviewed the forms of bias that can occur in interviews, and I had people discuss if they felt comfortable sharing, were they somebody who scored on average much higher than other people or lower, what potential forms of bias could have come into play in the situations. And so there's some proactive steps and also some reflective steps that you can take after to start addressing how bias can show up in interviews. And this is all from the same data pool that we typically only look at candidacy qualifications. Okay, and so one of the other things that I wanted to point out here, actually, next slide here, checking for bias in other ways. What I want to talk about before we get into some of the data is what absolute difference is. It's just the total distance between two numeric values. It's pretty simple math, but I know sometimes it's been many years for a lot of us since we've been in a math class. And so this helps out because you're not getting negative numbers when you're subtracting. So pretty obvious. And this will come up here and when you're looking at the total scores for all of our candidates as well. So instead of just looking at the total scores, I added this new column, absolute difference. So what that does is take like you can see in the candidate one's interview, a subtotal for each candidate was 14 and 11. The absolute difference was 3. So the distance between those two scores. There's a specific Excel function that I have at the end of the slide that lets you do this pretty easily. And so I'll have that at the end. But the reason that I'm talking about absolute difference is that this can be really helpful to really quickly and easily point out if there is a huge difference between interviewers and how they have scored a person. And so that would really highlight an area where a person might have been judged with bias, and that's something that you can then further look into to review and see whether or not if they are in a lower category than they maybe should be, or just for better or different consideration throughout the interview process. So at the bottom here, I have the lowest possible score that somebody could get in this theoretical interview, since there were 3 questions, and the lowest for each question they could get was 1. The lowest possible score somebody could get was 3, and the highest possible score is 15. So the max absolute difference that somebody could have in between 2 different interviewers is 12. And so when we start looking at the data in this way, you can see that Nick and Katie both took a very different understanding of what the candidates' qualifications were. And so that's a huge difference there. I would say 8, you're getting pretty close to the max absolute difference. So the higher, the closer that the number gets to the max absolute difference, the more potential that there was for some form of bias or issue between those 2 interviewers. And then as you get into like candidate 2's interview here, the absolute difference was only 2. So one of the things that I kind of want to point out with that is Nick and Sam could also be either they're both adequately judging evaluating the person with similar characteristics, or it could be that Nick and Sam also just were both really high scorers. Again, that's something that you can't totally start picking out and seeing until you get a lot more data to actually evaluate individual people and how their scores happened overall. But this absolute difference is a really great way to at least make sure that candidates have a little bit more looking into their interviews than just based off of the total score at the end of the interviews. So that's a really cool tool that can be used to make sure that everyone's evaluated on an equal playing field. And so beyond even just recruitment and selection, there's some really cool things that this data can show even for student leader training moving forward, or even just training for any professional staff if you also apply this to professional staff interviews. So again, we have our basic interview data here, but instead of looking from things from side to side in the rows, I'm looking at them in columns here. So when you total out the individual scores for each question, you can kind of see if we have hired each one of these candidates, that this is the qualifications for our candidate pool. And so if you are taking a look at what each of those questions represents, in this example, it's crisis response, decision-making, and organization, you can see that our incoming candidate pool had scored much lower on crisis response than in other areas. And so while this is something that can be really useful in training, because you can really specifically highlight, crisis response needs to be something that we highlight quite a bit more in our training than these other areas. That's not to say that you shouldn't include decision making or organization or other things along those lines in training, right? But this gives you a really good understanding of the capacity that your team might be coming in with, and give you really good focus on how to move forward. And another thing is strengths and values. That is a very common question in a lot of interviews. And one of the really cool things that you can do is if you take all of the answers that people have written and what their strengths, what their values are, you can come up with a really great word map that shows you where people are at in your incoming cohort. And so if people have certain strengths, you can also help pick out teams and you can separate out the data by the teams that they're put into. And you can start actually making intentional choices to have intentionally mixed groups with different strengths coming in. And this can also be a very just fun visual way to show the data that you have for selection. Another thing that you can do beyond a word map is actually just see what your incoming cohort's total strengths are. This gives you another look into some potential things here. So in this example, time management for the student leaders was not a strength that a lot of them shared. So if you come up with a list of what the ideal strengths that you have for your position that you're hiring for, in this example, I'm using communication, resilience, self-care, time management, and organization, you can start seeing where the candidates have then self-identified and pull all of that data together and show again that this is something that you can utilize in training, that this is something that we should potentially spend more time on in learning. And so there's some really cool tools online that make a lot of this super easy. Again, you can follow up with me if you are interested in any of this, and I can point you in the direction of some really great tools for that. And so one of the other ways that you can actually change the questions from a numeric scale, as I was talking about earlier, is that you can actually just make them focus on skills and what skills that you're trying to get at in the question. So with this sample question here, describe a time when you helped someone in crisis. What steps did you take? And one of the things you can have these as checkboxes in your interview scoring sheet. Did they make a referral to experts? Did they listen to the people in need and make sure that they felt understood and cared for? And you can have them checked off. And then you can even further evaluate that data to show that not only do you need to focus more on crisis intervention and training, but really helps you understand these are the specific areas that the incoming cohort might be strong in and also might be weaker in to really tailor that incoming training to your cohort. And while this moves away from a number scale, you can also still get pretty good numerical data on separating candidates out, because if somebody has all 4 skills, that's still numerical data that you can use to separate people into different groups. And so while the interviewer themselves are looking at a different thing and they're looking for those specific skills that they're sharing, it's a way to reduce some of that bias and just assigning a numerical value to a candidate, but you can still get that throughout the process. And so that's basically it. Just had a quick review here of everything that I went over, that typical pool of data that we've already have with selection and hiring. You can look back and perform bias reflections for the interviewers. Again, we talked about new methods to assess for bias scores with the absolute difference function. And there's definitely some applications to development of staff training that can absolutely be used to, again, create a tailored training for incoming cohort. So these are the 2 Excel functions that I talked about. If you're interested in, ABS is the absolute value of the data, and then average is a very simple one. I know not everybody is necessarily skilled with Excel either. If you ever wanted a quick tutorial on Excel or to help with looking at some of the data, I also would 100% be willing to talk moving forward on how to really look at the data and organize it and sort it and come up with good formulas to make it a lot easier, that you're not individually looking at each individual thing. So I appreciate the time that you all gave. Is there any questions, any thoughts, anything that you'd like to share with me? Yeah, Tess.
Hi. No questions, but I just wanted to say thank you so much for that presentation. I think that was really helpful. And I'm really interested in using this for our upcoming RA hiring cycle. And so I think like I was taking notes and I was like, oh, wow, these are really, really interesting things that I've never really thought about. So thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Just to echo Tess, definitely super interesting as I was kind of thinking about how to help people kind of digest and to make a little more widespread around our membership. Maybe even writing a little article that we can include with the newsletter when we post this recording, kind of explaining concepts to kind of encourage people to come in and either watch the recording or just kind of glean from the concepts. That would be a cool enhancement to getting these ideas out to our membership. Yeah, and since we do have some additional time, I was thinking about doing it at the beginning, but I don't want to eat up too much time. Just going around really quick and introducing ourselves and what our roles are. I forgot to say that I'm actually, my main role is with the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I'm the operations manager. I run the central office kind of operations. And so yeah, that's me. Tess, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, for sure. My name is Tess Bickley. I'm a residence life coordinator at Mount Royal University in Calgary, Alberta. And then I also serve as the Canadian membership director on the board.
Great, thanks. Tiffany, do you want to go?
Hello, I'm Tiffany Firestone. I use she, her pronouns. I serve as assistant director in residential education at Oregon State University, and I also get the privilege of being the NWACUHO technology director.
Great, thanks. Paul, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, Paul Hansen. I'm an architect in Seattle and do a lot of work on campuses. So I think this stuff is super interesting. After people are done introducing themselves, I had a question as well.
Yeah, I think there's only one more. Stephen, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, Stephen Jenkins. I currently serve as Associate Vice Provost for Student Affairs at Oregon State University and Executive Director of Housing and Dining here, and also serve as past president for NWACUHO.
Good, thanks. Back to you, Paul.
But you were showing very small samples in that. I think it gives you very narrow data that can get out of control really quick, or it doesn't maybe give you enough data points to even really reflect on. When dealing with interviewing, sometimes we're dealing with or ratings or any sorts of things. You're doing it over a large swath of people, and I think that's when you can really effectively use these smart tools, which is great. It kind of a little bit different tactics, perhaps, if you're dealing with a very small group of people, and how you try to get towards consensus on what you're trying to solve for.
Yeah, and that's something that it's really helpful to just think about data more, particularly when it's a smaller group. This is a lot more helpful when it is a much larger group, because again, it's a lot easier to start seeing trends. Once you get about 30 and above or so is when you can start really seeing whether or not this intentionally is showing specific things about the specific interviewers, etc., all of that. But definitely another way to at least look at to identify areas where there might be bias or other things that can be addressed. Yeah. And was there a specific question that you wanted to address?
No, I think you answered it right there. Like, kind of, there is at some level, 30 people or so, you start getting a change and a shift in that dynamic. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I think this is kind of a cool, because I have noticed over my years of interviewing that you do see those big gaps in the scoring, and not really having any kind of tools or language to identify any potential issues. Not that there is an issue, but at least to start the conversation that there might be something going on here that we want to discuss further. And our institution requires bias training, and there's lots of things to do for interview teams. And so because it's kind of already in the culture, identifying that bias influences interview process, I think this is a cool tool to at least just start the conversation versus just I don't know, not addressing these kind of potential issues.
Yeah, and absolutely. And that's one of the things too, that something like this can sometimes come across very differently to different people. So how this is presented, if you do a reflective activity with actual numbers. So that's something to also keep in mind, is that that this is entirely reflective and informative rather than evaluatory of the interviewers. I think that's something really important to discuss, and making sure that there is trust in the team and how you can talk about potential bias that has been brought into processes. So that's something that I think each team needs to navigate individually, of how this data could be looked at. But at least from a hiring committee standpoint, I think that this is a really good starting point to figure out, is there something that we can then bring to education to our interviewers, or is this more just looking at, should we give certain candidates who had a huge, a much higher difference between different interviewers, should we give them a second look to make sure that they are fully considered? And so, yeah, I think it's definitely something that it's a contextual decision on how to use and look at the data, but there's just so much that you can learn from it that we don't typically see.
Well, and I think for me, these conversations are always important because it's also just doing a culture of assessment, right? We all have some type of assessment goal, or overviews, or some type of accountability oversight in our programming. And so regardless of our level of assessment literacy, or just fear of numbers, right? I think it's just that idea of how whatever we do, doing things with intention, having that reflection. And I'm even thinking about, some institutions, some universities, organizations have folks that do institutional research, or are sort of those assessment folks. And so is it also learning who can we partner with at a university that can help us tap into those larger, spreadsheets, that it's not just on us to figure out how to find those meanings or outliers. Is it that there might be someone in-house within our units, or tapping somebody in that kind of institutional research office to assist on that cyclical in that cyclical way? And so I just, it always is a reminder that we want to be reviewing our programs, we want to be assessing, and then we often have that energy that's drained, or the year goes and we're putting out fires here and there. And so how can we also create sustainable ways to be actively reviewing our information in an ongoing, sustainable way?
Yeah. And one of the things I think that you just made me think about as well in connecting with others, I know at University of Oregon here, demographic data is held pretty close, that it's not as easy to get, but that's another area that you could potentially expand on this. If your university or college does share some of those demographic data out with people who are reviewing data, you could actually de-identify the individual candidates in the situation, and then look at how do different demographics how are they being evaluated in your process as well. And so there's so much more that you could attach to this, depending on what access to different data you also have within your own institution.
Okay, well, great. Does anybody else have anything else?
On one of your earlier slides, you had eliminate numeric scoring. I kind of forgot about that.
Yeah, so there is, Oregon State University has a really wonderful search advocate program. which goes a little bit more in depth into it. I am not necessarily, I'm unfortunately not the expert on that process yet at this point in my career. So it's there's a few different ways that can look. So that can be that you have sections that are, what are the candidate's strengths? What can they bring to your university? And then what are what are some potential areas of growth for the candidate? And then would you overall recommend, like highly recommend a hire? Do you recommend a hire? Do you not recommend a hire? Recommend with reservations, etc. And so that would be something that would be a lot more useful in a smaller pool of candidates, where you can actually discuss the individual differences between candidates and what their strengths are. And so I would say that that's one potential. And again, it depends on the amount of people that you're interviewing and accepting positions for. And that can also go into the other example that I had going through here at the end. Should have just stuck it with this one. Is that instead of having people score again on a 0 to 5 scale, having them check off they shared these individual skills in their responses, that still can give you a numerical value, but you're more specifically focused on that they have these specific skills. And so it's not an individual judgment or evaluation on that answer. And it's more that this is kind of combining your criteria for evaluation with your actual answer and evaluation. So it's more a way of making sure that the evaluation criteria is very explicit in the evaluation process. So there's a lot of different ways that this can look. And so I would highly recommend looking into the Search Advocate program that OSU offers. I'm not sure if they offer out to individual people to join the random sessions, or if they specifically host trainings at different institutions, universities, etc. But I think that's they have a really great resource that you can also email me, and I can help navigate what that looks like, because there's some really great information. But since it's an OSU project, I also don't want to share out in this presentation in particular without kind of talking with them beforehand what is the best way that I can include their information with my presentations, etc. So I think that's something that I will expand on and navigate once now that I've been seeing kind of what people are interested in. Anything else? Well, I appreciate all your time. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Nick. Thank you so much for coming and joining us for our first Friday webinars, of course, or I should say first Friday with NWACUHO, since we changed the tagline. But of course, we'll be doing this again next month. So please join us then. Thank you, everybody.